along those lines of the trial and Jesus' silence, Judge Brandon stole my Judge Judy reference, which we'll talk about that later. But how did trials in the first century A.D. differ from what we would see on a Judge Judy or Judge Joe Brown or Law and Order, or anything like that? I know you've got a lot to say about that, so I'll just let you run with it.
Well, first of all, most of what you see on Judge Judy and Law and Order and these other legal shows on television don't bear much resemblance to reality either. It's not what typically happens in a courtroom. There are several things to keep in mind, I think, about the trial, and there really were two trials here. As Tommy mentioned this morning, there was a trial before the religious authorities, and there was a trial before the political, the Roman authorities. But the thing to keep in mind about this trial is the same thing I said about the arrest last week. From the arrest through the crucifixion, there was nothing about this whole process that was legal. They broke every rule in Jewish law. They broke every rule in Roman law. And we're nearing the end of our time, and I could really spend an hour probably talking about the rules that were broken, but there are just a few that I'll mention. Like the arrest, as we talked last week, which happened at nighttime, which was a violation of Jewish law. The first trial before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, if you will, occurred at nighttime, and that too was illegal. Trials had to be conducted in the daytime, and we can follow that rule all the way up to today. We have a constitutional rule today that requires public trials. They cannot be held in secret. We don't typically hold nighttime trials, and you can trace that rule all the way back to the Romans and to the Jewish legal system of that time. Another thing that we ought to keep in mind about this is that this was the trial, especially before the Roman authorities, of a capital offense. The Jewish religious leadership was accusing Jesus of treason. They appealed to Pilate's political instincts, as Tommy mentioned this morning, and under Roman law, if an accused was being tried for a capital offense, there could not be a verdict of death rendered on the same day. The judges had to go home and sleep on it and pray about it, and that didn't occur here. The best way I can explain, I think, what we're talking about without getting into a lot of mundane details that probably don't interest you is this. Probably if I ask for a show of hands, as I do when I pick a jury, as to how many of you watch legal shows on TV, most of you would probably raise your hand. You can hardly turn the television on without seeing a legal show of some kind. Now, what I typically do not do is ask jurors if they believe what they see on those shows. I instead tell them that they need to understand that what they see on those legal shows is fiction, that things don't happen that way in real life. But there is one thing that you see on those legal shows that I suspect all of you are aware of that does help here, I think, to illustrate the kind of rules that were broken. I suspect all of you are familiar with what are called the Miranda warnings. You've seen those on television. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to be represented by counsel. If you can't afford counsel, one will be appointed for you. Those kinds of warnings. Well, when I was in law school, they taught us that those rules all could be traced back to the British common law. In reality, they can be traced all the way back to the Roman law. The Romans had a very advanced legal system. And Jesus was afforded none of those protections, if you will. But what you have to keep in mind, first of all, is that all of this was part of God's perfect will. So it's not too useful sometimes to talk about all these little rules that were broken. But under Roman law, for instance, Jesus had the right to have counsel represent him. He was never afforded that opportunity. He had the right, both under Mosaic law and under Roman law, not to be required to testify against himself. And you saw in the film clip here, Caiaphas demand that he answer a question, and then you saw the show that Caiaphas put on and tearing his clothes when Jesus gave the answer he did, and he said, that's blasphemy. Well, Jesus couldn't have been convicted of blasphemy based upon his own statements under Jewish law. It took the testimony of witnesses, and that's why you see the Jewish leadership scurrying, trying to find false witnesses who would testify against him. There are a number of other things. The presumption of innocence applied at that time, and Jesus was never afforded that. There was a rule that you had a right to confront your accusers. Well, other than the Jewish leadership, Jesus never had a right to accuse anybody, or never was afforded the opportunity to confront anybody who was accusing him. And in reality, there was nobody except the Jewish leadership who was. But bottom line is that they broke every rule in the book. They broke every legal rule. They broke every procedural rule that could be broken. But that leads me back to where I started, and that is that, in my view, it's not particularly useful to focus on those because this was all unjust. Jesus didn't deserve any of this. We're the ones who deserve this. He didn't. But he submitted himself to it willingly, and because of that, we have the gift of eternal life.